I woke up from anesthesia with my throat burning and my chest feeling like someone had parked a truck on it. But all I could think about was getting home to my property in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. The cardiac surgery had gone well according to Dr. Morrison, and after 3 days in the hospital, I was finally being discharged. My neighbor Jim had agreed to pick me up since my sister couldn't make it from Tulsa. And as we pulled into my driveway on that humid Tuesday afternoon in late June, I noticed something that made my medication-addled brain struggle to process what I was seeing. There was a fence running straight through my backyard. Not along the property line where it should have been, but a good 30 feet into my land, cutting off a significant chunk of my 2-acre lot that included my workshop, my tool shed, and half of the garden my late wife Martha had planted before she passed 2 years ago. "Jim, am I hallucinating from the painkillers, or is that what I think it is?" I asked, gripping the door handle of his truck. Jim's face went pale. "Jesus, Derek, that wasn't there when I drove past 4 days ago. That's Richard's fence, isn't it? The HOA president." "My name is Derek Ingram, and I'm 52 years old. I bought this property 15 years ago, long before the neighboring development went in, and Richard Patterson decided that our quiet rural road needed a homeowner association. I had specifically chosen this place because it was outside city limits, peaceful, and far enough from any HOA nonsense. But Richard had other ideas. 3 years ago, he started pressuring all the homeowners on our street to join his newly formed Oak Ridge Estates HOA, claiming it would increase property values and maintain neighborhood standards. I had refused repeatedly, showing him my deed and property survey that clearly indicated my land predated his development by a decade. I got out of the truck slowly, pressing my hand against the surgical incision on my chest. The fence was professional quality, 6 feet tall, solid cedar planks with metal posts sunk deep into concrete. This hadn't been some weekend project. This had been planned and executed with precision while I was lying on an operating table, having my arteries rerouted. "Help me walk back there," I said to Jim. "Derek, you just had open-heart surgery. Maybe you should rest and deal with this tomorrow. Help me walk back there, Jim." We made our way across the lawn, my legs shaky and my breathing labored. The fence ran in a perfectly straight line from the eastern edge of my property all the way to the western edge, cordoning off exactly 30 feet of my land. My workshop door was now on Richard's side of the fence. My tool shed was inaccessible. And Martha's rose bushes, the ones she had babied for 5 years before the cancer took her, were now in what Richard apparently considered his yard. I noticed a new gate in the fence, and it had a padlock on it. Richard's padlock. "That son of a bitch," I whispered. "He locked me out of my own property." Jim pulled out his phone. "I'm taking pictures. You're going to need documentation for the police." "The police won't do anything. They'll say it's a civil matter." I had learned that lesson years ago when Richard's wife Sharon had tried to fine me for not mowing my lawn frequently enough. The cops had shrugged and told me to get a lawyer. But I know someone who will do something about it. I called Tommy's Fence Removal, a company I had used once before when a windstorm had destroyed my old chicken coop fence. Tommy Briggs answered on the second ring. "Tommy, it's Derek Ingram out on Willow Creek Road. I need a fence removed, and I need it done tomorrow." "Derek, good to hear from you. How big are we talking?" "About 200 feet of 6-foot cedar fence, professional installation. Someone put it up on my property while I was in the hospital." There was a pause. "Someone put a fence on your land without permission." "That's exactly what happened. I've got my property survey and deed. This fence is 30 feet over my legal property line. Can you do it?" "I can have a crew out there by 8 in the morning. But Derek, you sure you want to do this without talking to a lawyer first? If someone's disputing the property line, this could get messy. There's no dispute. I had the property surveyed when I bought it. I've got iron stakes marking the corners and everything. This is cut and dry, Tommy. The fence is on my land. I didn't give permission and I want it gone. All right then. 8 o'clock tomorrow, I'll bring the equipment. Jim helped me inside and got me settled on the couch. He brought in my medications from the truck and filled a glass of water. You want me to stay? I don't like leaving you alone right after surgery. I'll be fine. My sister is coming tomorrow anyway, but I appreciate you, Jim. Really. After Jim left, I sat in the dimness of my living room and stared at the fence through my back window. Richard Patterson had always been a control freak, but this was beyond anything I had imagined. He was a real estate developer who had made his money building subdivision homes in the Tulsa metro area. And when he had moved to our road 5 years ago, he had immediately started trying to turn our quiet rural area into one of his cookie-cutter developments. He was in his mid-40s, always wore polo shirts with designer logos, and drove a black Mercedes SUV with vanity plates that read Builder 1. His wife Sharon was worse. She was the stereotypical HOA busybody, a blonde woman in her early 40s who wore too much makeup and seemed to have nothing better to do than patrol the neighborhood looking for violations of rules she had made up in her own head. She had tried to fine me for parking my truck on my own lawn once, claiming it was an eyesore. I had told her where she could stick her fine, and she hadn't spoken to me since except to glare whenever she drove past. But Richard, he was calculating. He had waited until I was at my most vulnerable, unconscious, and cut open on a surgical table to make his move. He must have had the fence company lined up and ready to go. The moment he knew I was in surgery, he had struck. I took my evening medications and managed to eat some soup before exhaustion hit me like a freight train. Recovery from cardiac surgery was no joke, and my body was demanding rest. But I slept fitfully that night, my dreams filled with fences closing in around me and Richard's smug face laughing as my property shrank and shrank until I had nothing left. At 7:30 the next morning, I was awakened by someone pounding on my front door. I struggled to my feet, my chest aching with every movement, and shuffled to the door. Through the peephole, I saw Richard Patterson standing on my porch, his face red with anger. I opened the door. "Richard, what can I do for you?" "You can explain why Tommy Briggs just called me asking about a fence removal on Willow Creek Road. You're not actually planning to remove the boundary fence, are you?" "Boundary fence? Richard, that fence is 30 feet onto my property. It's not a boundary fence. It's an illegal encroachment, and yes, I'm having it removed this morning." Richard's jaw clenched. "That fence marks the actual property line, Derek. Your survey is old and inaccurate." I had a new survey done, and it clearly shows that the land where that fence stands belongs to the HOA common area. The HOA that I'm not a member of. The HOA that was formed 3 years ago for a development that was built 5 years ago on land that I've owned for 15 years. That HOA. The property lines were incorrectly recorded when you purchased your land. The county has corrected the records, and the fence is on HOA property. I actually laughed, which hurt my chest. "Richard, you're full of it. The county didn't correct anything because there was nothing to correct. My property survey is accurate, my deed is clear, and that fence is on my land. It's coming down in 30 minutes. If you remove that fence, I'll sue you for destruction of HOA property. Go ahead. And while we're in court, we can discuss how you committed trespassing and possibly theft by locking up my workshop and tool shed behind your illegal fence. I'm sure the judge will find that very interesting." Richard stepped closer, and I could smell his cologne, something expensive and overpowering. You've been a thorn in this community's side since we formed the HOA, Derek. You refuse to follow the rules, you let your property become an eyesore, and now you're trying to claim land that doesn't belong to you. This is bigger than you. This is about maintaining property values for everyone on this street. I don't care about your property values, Richard. I care about my land, which you stole while I was having surgery. Now get off my porch before I call the police for harassment. You're making a huge mistake. Richard turned and stormed back to his Mercedes, which he had parked blocking my driveway. He peeled out, leaving rubber marks on my concrete. At exactly 8 o'clock, Tommy Briggs arrived with 2 trucks, a crew of 4 men, and equipment that included a heavy-duty reciprocating saw, a small excavator for pulling fence posts, and a flatbed trailer for hauling away the debris. Tommy was a big guy in his 30s, built like someone who had spent his life doing physical labor, and he had a no-nonsense attitude that I appreciated. "Derek, you look like hell. Should you even be out of bed?" "Probably not, but I need to be here for this." "You got my property survey?" "Got it right here. I already walked the line this morning before you woke up. I found your iron stakes at the corners, and you're absolutely right. That fence is 30 feet over the line. This is clear-cut trespassing." He pulled out a copy of my survey with notes and measurements written on it. I also took the liberty of calling my buddy at the county assessor's office. "Your property boundaries are exactly as recorded on your original survey. There's been no correction, no change, nothing. Whoever told you otherwise was lying." That would be Richard Patterson, the HOA president. "He's probably going to show up and cause problems. Let him. I've got documentation, you've got documentation, and we're removing a structure from your property that was installed without your permission. We're completely in the right." Tommy's crew got to work. They started by cutting through the fence panels with the reciprocating saw, making quick work of the cedar planks. The sound of the saw echoed across the neighborhood, and within minutes, I saw curtains twitching in windows. People were watching. At 8:30, Richard returned, and this time he brought Sharon and 2 other people I recognized as HOA board members. Karen Whitmore was a woman in her late 40s with short brown hair and a perpetual expression of disapproval. She lived 4 houses down and had once tried to organize a petition to force me to paint my house because she didn't like the color. Todd Jennings was a younger guy, maybe 35, who worked in IT and seemed to go along with whatever Richard said. "Stop this immediately," Richard shouted at Tommy's crew. "This is destruction of HOA property." Tommy didn't even look up from where he was supervising the excavator pulling up fence posts. "This is removal of an illegal structure from private property. If you interfere, you'll be charged with obstruction." Sharon stepped forward, her voice shrill. "You can't do this. That fence cost the HOA $12,000. We'll sue you for every penny." I walked over slowly, still pressing my hand against my chest. "Then you shouldn't have built it on my land, Sharon. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? Or did you hope that I'd die on the operating table and you could steal my property while my estate was in probate?" Her face went white, then red. "How dare you accuse me of something like that? This is about property boundaries, not about your surgery." "Really?" "Because it's one hell of a coincidence that you built this fence during the exact 3 days I was in the hospital. You knew I couldn't stop you. You knew I was vulnerable, and you decided to make your move." Karen stepped in. "The HOA board voted unanimously to install a boundary fence along what our survey determined to be the correct property line. We had every right to protect our common area." Tommy finally turned around. "Madam, I've been doing this for 20 years. I know a property line dispute when I see one, and this isn't one. This is 30 feet over the legal boundary. If your survey said otherwise, you got scammed by whoever did it, or you're lying. Either way, this fence is coming down. We'll call the police, Todd said, pulling out his phone. Go ahead, I replied. I've got my deed, my survey, and photographs showing that this fence was installed without my permission on my property. What have you got? Richard's expression changed. He went from angry to calculating in a heartbeat. All right, Derek, let's be reasonable here. Maybe there was a misunderstanding about the property line. Maybe we can work something out. What if the HOA paid you for an easement? We could draw up an agreement where you allow the fence to remain and we compensate you for the use of the land. No. Just no. You won't even consider it. You put a fence through Martha's rose garden, Richard. You locked up my workshop where I have $20,000 worth of tools. You cut off access to my tool shed. And you did it while I was unconscious having surgery. There's no deal here. The fence comes down, you stay off my property, and if you ever pull something like this again, I'll bury you in court. Richard's facade cracked completely. You stubborn old fool, this could have been easy. We could have worked together. But no, you have to be difficult about everything. Fine. We'll see you in court and we'll take everything you have. Get off my property. The HOA contingent left and Tommy's crew continued working. By noon, the entire fence was down. The posts were pulled, the panels were loaded onto the trailer, and Tommy's crew was raking the disturbed ground smooth. My workshop was accessible again. My tool shed was back on my side of the property line. And Martha's roses, while a bit trampled from the fence installation, were still alive. Tommy refused to take the cedar panels. That's your property now, Derek. They built it on your land with your materials, legally speaking. You can sell it, burn it, or build something with it. Up to you. What do I owe you? $3,500. I know it's not cheap, but that was a substantial fence, and we had to be careful not to damage your buildings. I wrote him a check, and he and his crew packed up and left. I stood in my backyard, exhausted and hurting but satisfied. The property was mine again, all of it. My sister Hannah arrived that afternoon, driving down from Tulsa with a trunk full of groceries and a determined expression. Hannah Anderson was 3 years younger than me, a retired nurse who had helped care for Martha during her final months and who had insisted on helping me through my recovery. "Derek, what on earth happened here?" she asked, looking at the torn-up ground where the fence had been. I explained everything while she made me sit down and checked my vital signs. Her face grew progressively more horrified as I told her about the fence, about Richard's visit, and about the confrontation that morning. "You should have called me before you had that fence removed. You just had major surgery. You should be resting, not dealing with property disputes." "Hannah, I couldn't let it stand. If I had waited, Richard would have claimed adverse possession or some other legal nonsense. I had to act immediately." She sighed and took my blood pressure, frowning at the reading. "Your BP is elevated. You're stressed, and stress is the last thing you need right now. I'm staying here for at least 2 weeks, and you're going to rest whether you like it or not." That evening, I received a certified letter delivered by a courier. It was from Richard's attorney, a firm called Morrison, Webb and Associates out of Tulsa. The letter informed me that I was being sued by the Oak Ridge Estates HOA for destruction of property, harassment, and interference with HOA operations. They were seeking damages of $15,000 plus legal fees. I called my own attorney, David Brennan, who I had used for estate planning after Martha died. David was in his 60s, a plain-spoken country lawyer who had practiced in Broken Arrow for 40 years. "Derek, I heard about your surgery. How are you feeling?" "I've been better, David, but that's not why I'm calling. I explained the situation, reading him the demand letter. David was quiet for a moment. Let me get this straight. They built a fence 30 feet onto your property without permission. You had it removed, and now they're suing you. That's the situation. You have your property survey? Yes, and Tommy Briggs verified the property line before he removed the fence. The county assessor's office confirmed my boundaries are correct. Then this is frivolous. They're trying to intimidate you into settling. Don't worry about it. I'll file a response, and I'll also file a counterclaim for trespassing, theft of use of your property, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. You were recovering from surgery, and they deliberately chose that time to encroach on your land. That's not going to look good to a judge. What's this going to cost me, David? Depends on how hard they fight. If they're smart, they'll drop it as soon as they see our response and the documentation. If they're stupid, we'll end up in court, and it'll run you maybe $5,000 to $10,000 in legal fees. But Derek, you'll win. This is clear-cut, and we might even get your fees awarded if the judge decides their suit was malicious. Do it. File everything you need to file. I'm not backing down. Over the next 2 weeks, while Hannah forced me to rest and recover, the situation escalated. Richard filed a complaint with the county claiming that I had illegally destroyed a fence. The county sent an inspector who looked at my survey, looked at the property, and closed the complaint with a determination that I had acted within my rights as a property owner. Sharon Whitmore started a whisper campaign in the neighborhood, telling everyone that I was a dangerous lunatic who destroyed property and threatened people. Several neighbors who I had always gotten along with suddenly stopped waving when they drove past, but not everyone bought into it. Jim came by with his wife to check on me, bringing a casserole and their support. Another neighbor, an older woman named Dorothy Chen, who had also refused to join the HOA, stopped by to tell me that she thought what Richard had done was reprehensible. He tried the same thing with me 2 years ago, Dorothy said. She was in her 70s, a retired school teacher who had lived on our road for 30 years. Not with a fence, but he claimed that my garage was too close to the property line and that the HOA had a right to make me move it. I showed him my building permit from 1995 and told him to pound sand. He backed off, but I knew he was just waiting for an opportunity to try something else. Why does he care so much? I asked. What does he get out of forcing everyone into his HOA? Dorothy smiled grimly. Control and money. The HOA charges dues, and Richard's construction company gets paid to maintain the common areas. He's essentially created a system where everyone pays him to tell them what to do with their own property. It's quite the racket. That gave me an idea. I asked David to look into the HOA's finances and structure. What he found was illuminating. The Oak Ridge Estates HOA had been formed by Richard's development company and included mandatory membership for anyone who bought a house in his subdivision. But our road, Willow Creek Road, had existed long before Richard's development. Several of us, including me and Dorothy, owned property that predated the HOA by many years. We had never signed any covenant or agreement to join. But Richard had been slowly trying to expand the HOA's jurisdiction by claiming that the entire road was part of the community. He had convinced several newer homeowners who had bought existing houses to join voluntarily, and he had been using their dues to fund improvements that benefited everyone on the road, like street light maintenance and snow removal. Then he used those improvements to pressure non-members to join, claiming we were getting services without paying our fair share. It was clever, but it was also completely unenforceable. You can't force someone to join an HOA by providing unsolicited services and then demanding payment. David filed our counterclaim 3 weeks after my surgery. We sued the HOA and Richard personally for trespassing, conversion of property, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and abuse of process. We asked for $20,000 in damages plus legal fees. Richard's attorney responded with an amended complaint that now included additional claims. They were alleging that I had violated county noise ordinances by having the fence removed early in the morning, that I had created a safety hazard by leaving torn-up ground where the fence had been, and that I had defamed Richard by accusing him of theft. It was absurd, and David said as much in his response. They're throwing everything at the wall hoping something sticks. It won't, but it does mean we're probably going to trial. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for late August at the Tulsa County Courthouse. By then, I was feeling much better physically. My incision had healed, my energy was returning, and my cardiologist was pleased with my recovery. But the stress of the lawsuit was taking its toll in other ways. I wasn't sleeping well, and I found myself constantly watching my property line, half expecting Richard to try something else. He didn't disappoint. In mid-August, I received a notice from the County Code Enforcement Office claiming that my property was in violation of county regulations regarding maintenance and upkeep. Specifically, they claimed that my lawn was overgrown, that I had junk vehicles on the property, and that my workshop was an unpermitted structure. All three claims were false. My lawn was mowed regularly. I didn't have any vehicles on my property except my truck, which was registered and functional. And my workshop had been properly permitted when I built it 12 years ago. I called the Code Enforcement Office and spoke to the inspector who had filed the report, a man named Gary Stevens. Mr. Stevens, I'm looking at the violation notice you sent, and I have to tell you, none of these things are accurate. Sir, I personally inspected your property on August 10th, and I observed all of the violations listed. You inspected my property. I never gave you permission to enter my property. There was a pause. HOA officers have the right to request inspections on behalf of community members. I'm not a member of the HOA. You trespassed on my property. Another pause. Sir, the complaint was filed by the Oak Ridge Estates HOA president, and we responded according to protocol. Gary, I need you to listen carefully. I am not a member of that HOA. I have never been a member. Richard Patterson has no authority over my property. He's currently being sued for trespassing on my land, and now you've trespassed too. I want that violation notice withdrawn immediately, or my attorney is going to file a complaint against both you and Richard for harassment. Sir, I'm just doing my job. Then do it correctly. Check your records. Look at property ownership. Verify HOA membership before you act on complaints. Or better yet, talk to the Tulsa County Attorney's Office, because I guarantee my lawyer is about to call them. I hung up and immediately called David, who was furious. He contacted the county attorney's office and the code enforcement supervisor. By the end of the day, the violation notice had been withdrawn, and Gary Stevens had been reprimanded for failing to verify the complaint before acting on it. But the damage was done. Richard had succeeded in demonstrating that he could use official channels to harass me, and he had gotten away with it with nothing more than a slap on the wrist for his inspector. The preliminary hearing in late August was my first face-to-face encounter with Richard since the morning the fence came down. We were both seated in the courtroom waiting area, him with his attorney, a slick-looking man in his 30s named Brad Morrison, me with David. Sharon was there too, sitting primly beside her husband, wearing a dress that probably cost more than my truck. She kept shooting me venomous looks, and at one point, she leaned over to whisper something to Karen Whitmore, who had also shown up. They both laughed, and I knew they were talking about me. I didn't care. I had the truth on my side. Judge Patricia Holbrook was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had been on the bench for 20 years. She listened to both sides present their cases, reviewed our documentation, and made her decision quickly. Mr. Morrison, I've reviewed your client's complaint, and I have to say, I'm not impressed. Mr. Ingram has provided clear documentation showing that the fence in question was built 30 feet onto his property without permission. Your client has provided a survey that contradicts the county records, but you've offered no explanation for the discrepancy. Can you explain why I should give any weight to your survey over the official county records? Brad Morrison stood. Your Honor, we believe the county records contain an error that dates back to Mr. Ingram's original purchase. We're working to have the records corrected. Working to have them corrected. So you're admitting that currently the official records support Mr. Ingram's position. The official records are incorrect, Your Honor. That's not what I asked. Do the current official records support Mr. Ingram's property boundaries as claimed? Morrison hesitated. Yes, but then Mr. Ingram was within his rights to remove a structure that was built on his property without permission. Furthermore, I'm troubled by the timeline here. Your client installed this fence while Mr. Ingram was hospitalized for major surgery. That timing suggests your client knew Mr. Ingram would be unable to stop the installation or respond quickly. That's not the behavior of someone acting in good faith. Richard leaned forward and whispered urgently to his attorney, who nodded and stood again. Your Honor, my client is willing to drop the lawsuit if Mr. Ingram withdraws his counterclaim. Both parties can walk away. Judge Holbrook looked at David. Mr. Brennan, what's your client's position? David stood. Your Honor, my client has spent $3,500 removing an illegal fence, has been subjected to harassment through the code enforcement system, and has suffered emotional distress while recovering from a life-threatening surgery. We're not interested in walking away. We want compensation for damages, and we want an injunction preventing the HOA from taking any further action regarding my client's property. The judge nodded. I'm inclined to agree. Mr. Morrison, I'm dismissing your client's complaint with prejudice. The lawsuit is frivolous, and I'm awarding Mr. Ingram his legal fees for defending against it. As for Mr. Ingram's counterclaim, I'm setting a trial date for October 15th. Both parties should be prepared to present evidence regarding damages and to address the issue of an injunction. Are we clear? We were very clear. Richard's face was red as he left the courtroom, and Sharon looked like she wanted to spit fire at me, but I felt vindicated. The judge had seen through their nonsense, and now we were going to trial where I could get justice. September passed quietly. I continued recovering, getting stronger every day. Hannah stayed with me through the end of August and came down from Tulsa on weekends after that. I worked in my workshop, restoring old furniture and building a new garden bed where the fence posts had torn up the ground. Martha's roses were recovering nicely, and I took comfort in caring for them the way she had. But I was also preparing for trial. David deposed Richard, Sharon, and the other HOA board members. The depositions revealed some interesting information. Richard admitted that he had known I was having surgery because Sharon had overheard Dorothy mention it at the grocery store. He claimed the timing was coincidental, but couldn't explain why the fence company had been contracted and paid a rush fee to install the fence during that specific 3-day window. Sharon admitted that she had been the one to file the code enforcement complaint, claiming that she was concerned about property values. When asked why she was concerned about my property specifically, she said it was because I refused to join the HOA and follow community standards. Karen Whitmore's deposition was particularly enlightening. Under questioning, she admitted that she had never actually seen the survey that Richard claimed showed the fence was on HOA property. Richard had told the board about it, but he had never provided copies. The board had voted to install the fence based solely on Richard's representation that it was legal. Todd Jennings was the weakest link. He admitted that he had felt uncomfortable about the fence project, but had gone along with it, because Richard was usually right about these things. When David pressed him about whether he had asked to see documentation, Todd admitted he hadn't. David was confident. "They have no real defense, Derek." Richard lied to his own board, rushed through a fence installation while you were vulnerable, and then tried to use the legal system to intimidate you into accepting his land grab. Any reasonable judge or jury is going to see that. The trial began on October 15th. It was a bench trial, meaning Judge Holbrook would decide rather than a jury. David had recommended this approach, saying that judges were generally less swayed by emotional appeals and more focused on facts and law. The courtroom was small, and aside from the parties involved, only a handful of people were present. Hannah sat behind me for support. Dorothy Chen was there, as was Jim. On Richard's side, Sharon and several HOA board members filled the benches. David presented our case methodically. He introduced my property survey, my deed, and documentation from the county assessor's office confirming my property boundaries. He showed photographs of the fence installation taken by my neighbors, clearly showing that the fence was far from where any reasonable boundary would be. He called Tommy Briggs as a witness. Tommy testified about finding my property markers, about verifying the boundaries against county records, and about the professional quality of the fence installation, which he said would have required several days of planning and preparation. "In your professional opinion, was this fence installed hastily, or was it a planned project?" David asked. "It was definitely planned. You don't get a fence like that installed in 3 days without advance preparation. The materials had to be ordered, the crew had to be scheduled, the post holes had to be dug according to specific measurements. This was at least a 2-week planning process, probably more." Then David called Dorothy Chen, who testified about Richard's pattern of trying to expand HOA control over non-member properties. Brad Morrison's cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective. He tried to suggest that Dorothy was biased because she was my friend, but Dorothy calmly pointed out that she barely knew me socially and was testifying about her own experiences with Richard's behavior. Morrison then tried to attack Tommy's testimony by suggesting that he had a financial interest in supporting my case since I had paid him to remove the fence. Tommy pointed out that he had been paid for fence removal, not for testimony, and that he would testify the same way regardless of who had hired him because the facts were the facts. When it was Morrison's turn to present Richard's case, things fell apart quickly. He called Richard to the stand, and David's cross-examination was brutal. "Mr. Patterson, you knew Derek Ingram was having surgery on June 23rd, correct?" "I heard something about it, yes." "You heard something about it. And when did you contract with the fence company to install the fence on his property?" "I'd have to check my records. Allow me to refresh your memory. You signed a contract with Precision Fencing on June 18th, 5 days before Mr. Ingram's surgery. The contract specified that installation would begin on June 23rd and be completed by June 25th. Those dates just happened to be the exact 3 days Mr. Ingram was in the hospital. Was that coincidence? The fence company's schedule is what it is. I don't control when they're available." David held up a document. "This is an email from you to Precision Fencing dated June 15th. In it, you write, I need this installation done between June 23rd and June 25th. I'll pay a 20% rush fee for that specific time frame. Why did you need that specific time frame, Mr. Patterson? Richard shifted in his seat. I wanted the project completed before the end of the month. The end of the month was June 30th. You had a whole week after the 25th. Why did it have to be those 3 specific days? I don't recall. You don't recall writing an email where you offered to pay an extra $2,400 to get a fence installed during the 3 days your neighbor was having open-heart surgery, Morrison objected. Your Honor, counsel is badgering the witness. Overruled. The witness will answer the question. Richard glared at David. I wanted the fence installed quickly. That's all. David nodded and moved on. Mr. Patterson, you told your HOA board that you had a survey showing the fence would be on HOA property, correct? Yes. Please provide that survey to the court. I don't have it with me. You don't have it in court for a trial about a property boundary dispute. Did you leave it at home? I'm not sure where it is currently. So you've lost the survey. The critical document that supposedly proves your entire case. I haven't lost it. I just don't have it with me. Mr. Patterson, did you ever have a survey done? Morrison stood. Your Honor, I need to consult with my client. Judge Holbrook looked annoyed. You should have consulted with your client before trial, Mr. Morrison, but I'll give you 5 minutes. The recess was tense. Morrison and Richard had a whispered, heated conversation in the hallway. When we returned, Morrison stood. Your Honor, I need to request a continuance. My client needs time to locate the survey document. Judge Holbrook shook her head. Mr. Morrison, this case has been active for months. Your client has had ample time to gather documentation. The request for continuance is denied. Mr. Brennan, please continue. David didn't hesitate. Mr. Patterson, I'll ask again. Did you ever have a survey conducted of the property line between Mr. Ingram's land and the HOA common area? Richard's jaw clenched. No. So when you told your board that you had a survey proving the fence would be on HOA property, you were lying. I based my belief on the property descriptions in the HOA covenant. The HOA covenant that Mr. Ingram never signed and is not subject to. That covenant. The covenant describes the boundaries of the HOA common area. And does that description include 30 feet of Mr. Ingram's legally owned property? I believe the property description in Mr. Ingram's deed is incorrect. Based on what evidence? Based on my professional experience as a developer. So to be clear, you had no survey, no official documentation, no evidence whatsoever to support your belief that Mr. Ingram's legal property deed was wrong. You just decided, based on nothing, that you owned 30 feet of his land. Richard didn't answer. David pressed on. And having made that decision based on no evidence, you waited until Mr. Ingram was having major surgery, then had a fence installed on his property over a 3-day period when you knew he couldn't stop you, correct? I installed a fence on what I believed to be HOA property. You installed a fence that blocked his access to his workshop and tool shed. You installed a fence through his late wife's rose garden, and you did it while he was unconscious on an operating table. Is that correct? Richard's face was red. I acted within what I believed were the HOA's rights. Rights based on no evidence, no documentation, and no legal authority. And when Mr. Ingram had the fence removed from his property, you sued him for $15,000 in a case that this court has already dismissed as frivolous. Is that correct? Morrison was objecting constantly, but Judge Holbrook overruled him each time. She was watching Richard with an expression of clear disapproval. When David finally finished with Richard, Morrison called Sharon to the stand. It didn't go any better for them. Sharon testified that she had filed the code enforcement complaint because she was concerned about the neighborhood. Under cross-examination, David got her to admit that she had never actually seen any of the violations she reported, that she had filed the complaint purely to harass me, and that she had done so at Richard's suggestion. The trial lasted 2 days. In closing arguments, David laid out a clear narrative. Richard Patterson had wanted control over my property, had fabricated a justification based on no evidence, had deliberately chosen to act while I was at my most vulnerable, and had then used the legal system and government agencies to continue harassing me when I defended my property rights. Morrison's closing was weak. He tried to argue that it was a good faith mistake, that Richard had genuinely believed the property line was different, and that the lawsuit was simply an attempt to resolve a dispute. But he couldn't explain away the timeline, the lack of documentation, or Richard's own testimony admitting he had no survey and no evidence. Judge Holbrook took less than an hour to reach her decision. When we reconvened, she looked tired and annoyed. "I've reviewed all the evidence and testimony in this case, and I have to say, this is one of the more egregious examples of property overreach I've seen in my time on the bench. Mr. Patterson, you had no legal basis for installing a fence on Mr. Ingram's property. You had no survey, no documentation, and no evidence to support your claim that the property line was different than the official county records showed. Despite this, you proceeded with a costly fence installation deliberately timed to occur while Mr. Ingram was hospitalized and unable to respond." She paused and looked directly at Richard. "What troubles me most is the pattern of behavior here. You didn't stop with the fence. You filed a frivolous lawsuit. You used code enforcement as a harassment tool. You've consistently abused your position as HOA president to target someone who simply wants to be left alone on his own property. That behavior is unacceptable." She turned to her written decision. "I find in favor of Derek Ingram on all counts. The HOA and Richard Patterson are jointly liable for damages in the amount of $20,000, which includes Mr. Ingram's costs to remove the fence, his legal fees, and compensation for emotional distress. Additionally, I'm issuing a permanent injunction prohibiting the Oak Ridge Estates HOA from taking any action regarding Mr. Ingram's property, from filing complaints or violations, and from making any claim to jurisdiction over his land. Any violation of this injunction will result in contempt charges." She looked at Richard again. "Mr. Patterson, I'm also ordering you personally to pay Mr. Ingram's legal fees for defending against your original lawsuit in the amount of $7,500. That's in addition to the $20,000 in damages. Perhaps that will encourage you to think twice before using the legal system to bully your neighbors in the future." Richard's face went pale. Sharon gasped audibly. Karen Whitmore started whispering urgently to the people around her. Judge Holbrook banged her gavel. "We're adjourned." Walking out of that courtroom, I felt lighter than I had in months. Hannah hugged me, Dorothy congratulated me, and even Jim, who had shown up for the verdict, shook my hand. "You did it," David said. "Complete victory. They owe you $27,500 total, and they can never bother you again." "Will they pay?" "They'll pay. If they don't, we'll put a lien on Richard's property. The court will make sure you get your money." Over the next few weeks, the fallout continued. Richard resigned as HOA president, apparently under pressure from other board members who were furious about the judgment and the damage to the HOA's finances. Sharon stopped speaking to anyone in the neighborhood and apparently spent most of her time inside their house. Karen Whitmore also resigned from the board, and the HOA held emergency elections. Dorothy Chen told me that several members were pushing to dissolve the HOA entirely, arguing that it had become a liability rather than an asset. I received my payment in early November, a check for the full amount delivered by Morrison's office with no accompanying note or apology. I deposited it and used some of the money to restore Martha's rose garden properly, hiring a landscaper to repair the damage and add new bushes. The rest went into savings and toward paying off some remaining medical bills from my surgery. Richard and Sharon put their house up for sale in December. According to Jim, they were moving to Arkansas, where Richard had another development project. I didn't care where they went as long as it was far away from me. The injunction held firm. The HOA never contacted me again about anything. My property was mine, clear and unmolested, exactly as it should have been all along. By Christmas, my recovery was complete. My cardiologist gave me a clean bill of health, my energy was back, and I was working full days in my workshop again. Hannah came down for the holiday, and we had a quiet celebration, just the two of us and a few close neighbors including Dorothy and Jim. On Christmas Eve, I stood in my backyard looking at Martha's restored rose garden. The bushes were dormant for winter, but they were healthy and strong, and they would bloom beautifully in spring. The property line was clear and undisputed. My workshop stood accessible and secure. And I had peace finally, after months of fighting for what was rightfully mine. I thought about Martha and how she would have handled this situation. She probably would have marched over to Richard's house the moment she saw that fence and given him a piece of her mind that he would never forget. She had been fierce in defending what was ours, and I like to think she would have been proud of how I had stood my ground. The legal system had worked eventually. It had taken months, thousands of dollars, and enormous stress, but justice had prevailed. Richard's attempt to steal my land while I was vulnerable had failed, and he had paid the price for his arrogance and cruelty. I learned some valuable lessons through the ordeal. I learned that documentation is everything. My property survey and deed had been the foundation of my entire case, and without them, I would have had a much harder fight. I learned that timing matters. Acting quickly to remove the fence before Richard could establish any claim to the land had been crucial. And I learned that standing up to bullies, even when you're exhausted and recovering from surgery, is worth it. The new year came, and with it, a fresh start. The neighborhood was quieter without Richard and Sharon. The HOA still existed, but it had new leadership that seemed more focused on actual community improvement rather than control and harassment. They repaved the road in February, and I had no problem with that. They organized a neighborhood watch program, and I participated willingly. When they did things that actually benefited everyone without overstepping boundaries, I was happy to cooperate. In March, new neighbors moved into Richard's old house. They were a young couple with 2 small children, and they seemed nice. I introduced myself and made it clear that I wasn't part of the HOA, but that I was happy to be a good neighbor. They understood, and we got along fine. Dorothy stopped by one spring afternoon while I was working in the garden. She brought lemonade and cookies, and we sat on my back porch looking out at the property. "You know, Derek, you did something important here," she said. "You showed everyone on this street that property rights matter, that you can't just bully people and take what isn't yours." A lot of people were watching how this turned out, and I think Richard's defeat changed some minds about how the HOA should operate. "I just wanted to be left alone on my own land," I said. "I know, but sometimes standing up for yourself helps other people too." Richard was getting bolder and more aggressive. If you hadn't stopped him, who knows what he would have tried next. Maybe he would have gone after my property again, or Jim's, or someone else's. You drew a line, and it mattered. I thought about that. I hadn't been trying to be a hero or make a statement. I had just been trying to protect what was mine, to defend the property that Martha and I had built our life on. But maybe Dorothy was right. Maybe my fight had been bigger than just my 30 feet of land. The roses bloomed in April, and they were spectacular. I cut a bouquet and took it to Martha's grave at the Memorial Park Cemetery in Broken Arrow. I told her about everything that had happened, about the fence and the fight and the victory. I told her that her roses were safe and beautiful, and that I was doing okay sitting there by her headstone. I realized how much I had been through in less than a year. Major surgery, property theft, legal battles, and the stress of fighting someone with more money and power than I had. But I had survived it all, and I had won. My heart was stronger, both literally and figuratively. My property was secure, and I had learned that I was tougher than I had given myself credit for. Life went on. I continued my woodworking, taking on custom projects for people in the community. I helped Jim build a deck that summer. I volunteered at Dorothy's church once a month, helping with their food bank. Hannah visited regularly, and we grew closer than we had been in years, bonded by the crisis we had weathered together. The injunction against the HOA remained in place, a legal shield protecting my property from any future overreach. Occasionally, I would see Karen Whitmore at the grocery store, and she would look away quickly, avoiding eye contact. I didn't hold grudges, but I didn't forget either. In June, on the 1-year anniversary of my surgery, I had a follow-up appointment with Dr. Morrison. He was pleased with my recovery and told me I was doing better than most patients a year out from the procedure I had undergone. "You've been through a lot this year," he said, reviewing my chart. "The surgery, the recovery, and I heard about some legal trouble you had. How are you managing stress?" "Better now that it's resolved," I said, "but it was tough for a while. Heart patients need to avoid major stress, but sometimes life doesn't cooperate. The important thing is that you came through it. Your heart looks good, your blood pressure is well controlled, and you're active and healthy. Just keep doing what you're doing." Driving home from that appointment, I felt grateful. Grateful to be alive, grateful for my health, grateful for my property and my home. The fence incident seemed almost surreal now, a bizarre chapter in my life that had ended as abruptly as it had begun. But it had taught me something important about standing up for myself and not backing down when I was in the right. That evening, I sat in my workshop and worked on a rocking chair I was building for Hannah's birthday. The tools around me represented thousands of hours of work and learning, and they had been locked away behind Richard's fence for those few days. The thought of losing access to them, to this space where I felt most at peace, had driven much of my determination to fight back. As I sanded the curved arms of the rocker, I thought about how property ownership is about more than just legal title. It's about the memories embedded in a place, the work you've put into it, the dreams you've built there. Martha and I had chosen this land together. We had planted the garden, built the workshop, created a life here. Richard's fence hadn't just been a property encroachment. It had been an invasion of everything Martha and I had built, and that's why I had fought so hard. The workshop smelled of sawdust and wood stain, familiar and comforting. My tools hung on the walls where they belonged, each one in its place. The floor was swept clean, and afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows. Everything was as it should be, and that was worth every penny I had spent, every hour of stress I had endured. Summer turned to fall, and the neighborhood settled into comfortable routines. The new HOA leadership held occasional meetings, but kept their focus on genuinely communal issues like organizing a neighborhood yard sale and planning holiday decorations. They never once approached me about joining or complained about my property. The injunction had made its point. I attended the neighborhood yard sale in September and sold some of Martha's old things that I had been holding on to for too long. It was time to let go of some of the past, to make room for whatever came next. A young woman bought Martha's sewing machine and was thrilled to get it. She planned to make quilts for her church, and I knew Martha would have approved. Dorothy bought an old toolbox I was selling, not because she needed it, but because she wanted to support the sale. We talked for a while about the changes in the neighborhood, about how much calmer things were now. I heard through the grapevine that Richard's new development in Arkansas is having problems, Dorothy said. Apparently, he got into a dispute with the local planning commission, and the whole project is stalled. Some people never learn, I said. No, they don't. But at least he's someone else's problem now. As October approached, I realized that a full year had passed since the trial. I had received every penny of the judgment, the injunction was firmly in place, and life had returned to a peaceful normalcy. The ordeal was truly over, not just legally but emotionally. I had processed the anger and violation I had felt, and I had moved forward. Hannah called one evening in late October with news. She had met someone, a retired engineer named Walter, and they were dating. She sounded happy, lighter than I had heard her sound in years. We talked about him, and she made plans to bring him down to meet me. I'm glad you're doing well, I told her. You deserve happiness. So do you, Derek. Have you thought about maybe meeting someone? It's been 2 years since Martha passed. I've thought about it, I admitted. But I'm not sure I'm ready, and honestly, I'm content right now. Maybe someday, but there's no rush. Fair enough. Just don't close yourself off completely. Martha wouldn't want you to be alone forever. She was right, of course. But grief and healing operate on their own timeline, and I wasn't going to force anything. For now, I had my work, my property, my family, and my neighbors. That was enough. The leaves turned brilliant colors that fall, and I spent hours raking them and preparing the garden for winter. The roses were healthy and strong, and I mulched around their bases to protect them from frost. They would sleep through the cold months and wake again in spring, just like they always did. Just like I had woken from the darkness of that operating room, from the violation of having my property stolen, from the stress and anger of the legal fight. In November, I hosted Thanksgiving for the first time since Martha died. Hannah came with Walter, who turned out to be a solid, decent man who made my sister smile. Jim and his wife came, and Dorothy, and a few other neighbors. We crowded around my dining room table, ate too much turkey, and laughed about silly things. After dinner, Walter asked about my workshop, and I gave him a tour. He was impressed with my tools and the projects I had completed. We talked about woodworking techniques, and he shared some tricks he had learned during his years working with precision instruments. Hannah told me about what happened with your fence, Walter said. That must have been incredibly stressful, especially right after surgery. It was. But I got through it, and justice prevailed in the end. That's not always how these things turn out. You were lucky to have good documentation and a good lawyer. And stubborn determination, I added. I wasn't going to let someone steal my land just because they thought they could. Walter nodded approvingly. Property rights are fundamental. If people can just take what isn't theirs without consequences, we don't really have a functioning society. You did the right thing fighting back. As everyone left that evening, Hannah hugged me tightly. This was wonderful, Derek. Thank you for opening your home. Thank you for pushing me to do it. I needed this. You're healing, she said. In more ways than one, I'm proud of you. Winter arrived with snow and cold, and I settled into the quiet rhythm of the season. I worked in my heated workshop, took long walks when the weather permitted, and caught up on reading. The neighborhood was peaceful under its blanket of snow, and I felt deeply content. On a cold evening in January, exactly 18 months after my surgery, I sat in my living room with a cup of coffee and thought about everything that had happened. The fence, the fight, the victory, the recovery. It all seemed distant now, like something that had happened to someone else. But it had shaped me, changed me in subtle ways. I was more careful now about documentation and boundaries. I was more willing to stand up for myself immediately rather than hoping problems would resolve on their own. I was more appreciative of the simple peace of being left alone on my own property. And I was more grateful for the people who had supported me through it all. The property was mine, fully and completely, protected by law and by the permanent injunction that would follow it through any future ownership. Richard Patterson's attempt to steal my land had failed utterly, and he had paid dearly for his arrogance. The justice system, slow and expensive as it was, had worked. The right side had won. As I looked out my window at the snow-covered yard, at the workshop standing solid and accessible, at the spot where Martha's roses slept under their mulch, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was my land, my home, my sanctuary. No HOA president, no illegal fence, no legal threat would ever take that away from me again. I had fought for what was mine, and I had won. That was the end of it, the final word, the resolution that let me move forward in peace. The next morning brought bright sunshine that made the snow sparkle like diamonds. I bundled up and went outside to clear my driveway, my breath forming clouds in the cold air. As I worked, I noticed Jim doing the same at his house, and we waved to each other. Simple neighborly interaction, the kind that should define a community rather than the control and conflict that Richard had brought. When spring came again, the roses bloomed more beautifully than ever, and I knew everything was exactly as it should be.